A Fox News alert, and the president's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is backpedaling after a bombshell interview in which he spoke out against white supremacist protesters and undercut President Trump's position on North Korea. Fox News now learning Steve Bannon is saying he believed that interview with the American Prospect magazine was off the record. Aren't they always?
Another one.
Good morning to you. I'm John Scott.
Let us know if you believe that one. I'm Heather Childress. Now, Bannon did not hold back at all in this interview with the liberal publication that was posted online on Wednesday. Now, in it, Bannon discussed some plans to, quote, neutralize his rivals in government. He also said that the U.S. faces an economic war with China, and he contradicted the president's threat of possible military action against North Korea, saying, quote, there is no military option on North Korea. And when asked if he still had confidence in Steve Bannon, President Trump said this.
I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist. I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. But he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
In Bannon's interview, he also attacked the far right, adding, quote, ethno-nationalism, it's losers, it's a fringe element. I think the media plays it up too much, and we got to help crush it, help crush it more. These guys are a collection of clowns. Brian Ennis is live for us in Bridgewater, New Jersey, where the president is holding a closed-door meeting at his golf course later today. So, Brian, what is the latest?
Well, the latest right now is really about the president's tweets. The president of the United States now saying affirmatively for the first time that he is for Confederate statues in a series of tweets this morning. He really called taking down these statues foolish. He says that taking these down would be ripping apart the U.S. culture. Let's read these tweets. Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Who's next? Washington, Jefferson. So foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced. These tweets come at a time, obviously, where it's completely controversial, and he's taking a stand now, and also at a time where cities like Baltimore and in North Carolina and in Florida and throughout the country are wrestling with whether or not they should take down these statues. Many statues have already been taken down by local municipalities. In the press conference on Tuesday, he was a little bit more ambiguous than he was in these tweets yet as to whether or not he would be for entirely taking all these statues down. Obviously, today he's a lot more affirmative. Listen to what he said on Tuesday about the topic.
Should statues of Robert E. Lee stay up?
I would say that's up to a local town, community, or the federal government, depending on where it is located.
And all of this after a surprising interview that you guys laid out over there in the intro to me with Steve Bannon and a left-wing publication called the American Prospect. Bannon calling a reporter last night talking about everything from North Korea to the infighting within the administration. He claims he believes that this conversation was off the record. A little bit tough to believe, obviously, in the sense that he was an executive editor at Breitbart News, the alt-right publication, for at least in 2012. So to hear that he says it was off the record is a little bit hard to believe, also given the fact with Anthony Scaramucci obviously making those comments and being fired from his job just 10 days when he made comments to a reporter that he thought were also off the record. He did mention that he called the alt-right clowns. You had mentioned that as well. But also in another interview with the New York Times, he made it clear that he welcomes Democrats and the left wing talking about race. In this interview with the New York Times, he says the race identity politics of the left wants to say it's all racist. Just give me more. Tear down more statues. Say the revolution is coming. I can't get enough of it. On top of all of this, in that interview, he did talk about his infighting with Trump's top economic advisor, Gary Cohn. He also pointed out that Susan Thornton, an advisor for the Secretary of State, Tillerson, he said that he had plans on firing her. Well, today, Tillerson shook Susan Thornton's hand in front of cameras cameras, a clear sign of support that she's not going anywhere. And in an interview, Bannon with the Daily Mail said today, quote, his remarks with the American Prospect magazine were good because they, quote, drew fire away from the President of the United States and changed the media narrative with a single phone call. This is a man, obviously, who the president has talked about perhaps being on the brink of losing his job, having a phone call that he thought perhaps was off the record, now saying that, wait a second, this phone call could have been a good thing. It's obviously changing the narrative in his mind. The story continues.
Yes,
guys.
It does. And the narrative constantly changing. Brian Yennis live for us. Thank you, Brian.
Well, President Trump was already under pressure from some quarters to fire his controversial chief strategist. So how will this interview affect Steve Bannon's relationship with the president? Here's more of what Mr. Trump had to say about his chief strategist before that interview was posted.
I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that.
Weighing in on this wild interview, Jordan Fabian, White House correspondent for The Hill, and Philip Wegman, commentary writer for the Washington Examiner. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Jordan, just when we thought this electric week couldn't get any more electric, comes this interview. Now, he says he thought it was off the record. Do you buy that?
I don't, John. Like Brian said in the last block, this is a guy who's 64 years old. He's a senior advisor in the White House, and he used to run a media company. And this is someone, by the way, who talks to reporters all the time. So he's got to know the ground rules that when you're speaking to a reporter, unless you indicate it's off the record, it is on the record. And it's interesting to see his effort to rationalize this statement he gave to the American Prospect by saying it was going to change the narrative and get the heat off Trump. If he never intended it to be on the record, it's really, I don't see how that would be the case, that it was meant to change the narrative. This is all these explanations aren't really adding up from Steve Bannon.
Yeah, Philip, same question to you. I mean, a guy named Anthony Scaramucci gave an interview that he thought was off the record, or so he says, and it got him canned. Do we really believe that Steve Bannon didn't think his words were going to be published?
Well, I'm with Jordan on this one. Steve Bannon is too smart to go full Scaramucci. I think one of two things are actually happening here. Either he knows that he's being pushed out of the White House and he's decided to go down in flames by criticizing the president and criticizing the administration, or he's decided to deliberately set himself on fire to prove a point that he can't be touched.
But here's one of the interesting things about the interview. He criticizes the alt-right movement, the people who he supposedly was the champion of in the White House. Jordan, does that make any sense?
Again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, John. He once called Breitbart News the, quote, platform of the alt-right. So whether Steve Bannon shares the views of the people who are marching in Charlottesville this weekend, doesn't really matter. He was kind of giving an implicit nod there to say, yes, we are kind of making this Breitbart platform a forum for these people. So for him to say, these people are clowns and they're kind of irrelevant doesn't really jibe with his career in the past 2 or 3 years in the media.
Philip, what about the choice of the outlet here? Not exactly a conservative publication. Why would he pick up the phone and call the Prospect to make these remarks?
Well, Steve Bannon seems to be playing his own game here. And on that last point about the alt-right, he certainly likes to decry these people as clowns, but he likes what they're doing. As long as this controversy continues, his thought seems to be that while the left consumes itself with identity politics, the right will have a free hand to pursue Trump's agenda. But while that sounds good on paper, it's not happening. Republicans are abandoning the president right now in Congress. They're not flocking to him.
Yeah, and he did say that in the article. He said, if the left focuses on identity politics, Jordan, and we, meaning he, the president, get jobs and the economy moving, they're going to crush the Democrats in the next election.
Yeah, but I think Philip has a good point there. You had both former presidents, Bush, come out and criticize the president for these statements. Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, not on board with what the president's saying, and there was already frayed relationships there. So, again, how is this focus on the Confederate statues and the events in Charlottesville helping to advance tax reform and health care? It's really not. Again, it's creating a rift within the party at a time when they need to be coming together to advance their agenda.
In the meantime, the president is said to be, sitting in Trump Tower, not paying a great deal of attention, Philip, to the storm that's going on around him.
Well, what's interesting about this, too, is that Steve Bannon, with one phone call, really erased one of President Trump's big victories. He's been heralded on the right for his stance on North Korea, for being aggressive. But then Bannon just called the prospect and basically said that all that talk about keeping all the options on the table, that's not really going to happen. So he definitely called his own bluff on this one.
It is an astounding interview. We're going to be talking about it for a while. Philip Wegman, Jordan Fabian, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, in the meantime, we still need to talk about North Korea because that is developing, and perhaps some people would say more importantly, China. They're pushing for restraint in the North Korea showdown, saying that military action should not be an option, while the top U.S. military officer, General Joseph Dunsford, agrees that it would in fact be horrific. He says that allowing the rogue nation to develop the capability to hit the United States with nuclear weapons would be, quote, unimaginable. And our new U.S. ambassador to Japan also weighing in on the crisis.
I think what you see with North Korea is the fact on display that all options are on the table to deal with this regime. I don't see any options being taken off the table by the United States, and I see the pressure by the international community mounting even greater against this regime until they begin to dial back their rhetoric and their dialogue becomes something much more reasonable. We await that, we look forward to that, and I expect that that will come.
The U.S. territory of Guam certainly would play a role in any military action, and our own William Lajeunesse was at the U.S. Air Base on Guam. He joins us now live from Tamaning, Guam. William.
Hey, John, there are two things that North Korea doesn't like. One, the B-1 bomber. Two, this joint U.S.-South Korean war exercise. That military drill actually begins on Sunday, while a new set of B-1 bombers just arrived here on Guam from the mainland. Now, North Korea sees both as a provocation and prelude to war. Now, the B-1B can reach Pyongyang in under 3 hours and is seen as key to knocking out their nuclear capability. Now, those bombers may or may not be involved on Sunday when we begin this 10-day joint military exercise with the South involving some 80,000 soldiers. Now, the U.S. calls it defensive. Kim Jong disagrees and he wants it stopped. South Korea's new president said that's not going to happen. In fact, he said that he considers sending a special envoy to the north, but Kim must first stop his nuclear program, to arm his missiles, that is, with a nuclear weapon.
Only South Korea can decide military actions on the Korean peninsula. Nobody can choose to carry out military action without South Korea's consent. The United States and President Trump have made a promise to fully cooperate and ask for our agreement in advance before utilizing whatever options they might use against the North.
Now, Tuesday, Kim agreed to hold off firing missiles at Guam, provided the U.S. also show some restraint. But as you mentioned, presidential advisor Steve Bannon says this current crisis entirely is a sideshow, and I'm quoting, "There's no military solution to North Korea's nuclear threat. Forget it. Until somebody solves the part of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from a conventional attack, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no military solution here. They got us." Which is why, John, as you know, many say only China can pressure North Korea to stop its nuclear program, which just yesterday both South Korea and Japan said were unacceptable. Back to you.
Unbelievably thorny equation. William Lajeunesse in Guam. William, thank you.
Well, President Trump defending his latest remarks on Charlottesville with some jabs at Senate Republicans who have criticized his response. How Lindsey Graham is responding today, and our political panel will weigh in on that. Plus, Attorney General Jeff Sessions continuing to speak out against sanctuary cities with Chicago in his crosshairs.
These policies do far broader damage to the country than many understand. They openly say, we are a welcoming city. Come into our city, and we won't even tell the federal police when you commit a crime if you're here unlawfully.
Well, breaking news on the fallout over President Trump's latest remarks on Charlottesville. The president firing back at Lindsey Graham on Twitter after the South Carolina senator accused the president of equating white supremacists with those who were in Charlottesville to protest them. The president responding today, quote, publicity-seeking Lindsey Graham falsely stated that I said there is moral equivalency between the KKK, neo-Nazis, and white supremacists, and people like Ms. Heyer. Such a disgusting lie. He just can't forget his election trouncing. The people of South Carolina will remember. And then the president tweeting this after Graham issued this statement. This is Graham's statement yesterday saying, quote, President Trump took a step backward by again suggesting there is moral equivalency between the white supremacist neo-Nazis and KKK members who attended the Charlottesville rally and people like Ms. Heyer. I, along with many others, do not endorse this moral equivalency. So let's bring in our political panel. Kristen Soltis Anderson. She is a columnist at the Washington Examiner and a Republican pollster. And Isaac Wright. He is a former executive director for the pro-Clinton super PAC, Correct the Record. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kristen, I'll start with you. Is that a fair assessment from Lindsey Graham?
I think Lindsey Graham is not wrong for thinking that Donald Trump's statements on Tuesday really set us backwards. That the statement that he made on Monday, it came a little too late, but he should have just left it there. And instead on Tuesday, by saying there were some very fine people that were at this rally, when there are folks that are showing up and they've got Nazi flags and they're demanding that Jews be cast out of society, you don't go looking for the nice people, the very fine people in that group, and you don't suggest that the folks on the other side were also to blame. Heather Heyer is not to blame for the violence that occurred, and so I think Lindsey Graham is in the right for criticizing President Trump.
But do you think that he was blaming the victim in this? I mean, I know everybody's been talking about this, but honestly,
imprecise, and that's why he shouldn't just shoot from the hip and go down to press conferences and say these things that even if he didn't mean it, and at this point I'm not inclined to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt, but even if he didn't mean it, what he said was, well, there's blame on all sides, and he goes back to this all sides thing, this many sides thing. Look, there are folks on the far left that are violent, and the time to call them out is not the time when a white supremacist drove a car into a pack of mostly peaceful